make some recommendations. We have a pretty busy and packed agenda, so I'm going to just jump us right in. Next slide, please. I want to just remind folks that if you are a voting member of the SBAC, to please, if at all possible, have your screens on and make sure your name is not just your name, but also reflective of the group that you are here, the group or the committee that you're here representing. The chat is exclusive to conversations of agenda items and only should be used by voting members. We're going to ask that, again, we only can see so many names at a time. So if you are raising your hand to speak or ask a question on an item and you're not being heard, just unmute and say, hey, and we will make sure that we stop and acknowledge you. Next slide. This is just a regular slide that reminds folks of the different tools on our Zoom toolbar as we are all engaging in this meeting via Zoom. But I look forward to the opportunity to meet you all one day in person. Next slide. So here's our agenda for today. We're doing our opening moves as I speak, which is our welcome. We're going to do our roll call very shortly, and then we're going to do public comments. And then the focus of today's meeting, like I said, it's a pretty packed agenda. You all had homework, but we know that different committees are meeting at different times and have a different cadence. So everyone was not able to complete that homework, and we expected that. So we will look at answering some of the committee questions that came through from the homework assignment. We want to also do a little overview of some of the other revenue sources. Remember that our SBAC committee really is going to focus on making recommendations for our unrestricted general funds, but we know that that is just a piece of the entire budget pie of BUSD. We have other revenue sources that we want you to be aware of as members of the SBAC, so that as you're making recommendations, so that as we have conversations about where we might need to or have to or want to move items across budget sources, you understand where other budget sources are, what they are, how much they are, and what they entail. So those two revenue sources today that we're going to talk about is both BSEP and then our one-time arts and music grant. And then after that, Pauline is going to take us through a trade-off activity to preview and model for us, but we're going to have some meetings to come, right? We already have looked at our recommendations, and we know that we can do anything, but we cannot do everything. And already on the recommendations that have carried over from last year, there's a lot that we're trying to do. And we know that there are current needs that we've shared with you all, but also different committees are coming in with needs and requests. So we know that at some point as a group, we're going to have to make some decisions. We're going to have to prioritize and actually do some trade-offs. We're going to have to decide and engage in what we're going to continue to do, what we're going to start to do, but also, quite honestly, what we might have to stop doing. And so Pauline's going to just take us through an example of that, just to get our feet wet, because we're going to be doing it very shortly in the meetings to come. And then finally, we're going to do our closing moves. Next slide, please. Want to remind us of these resource allocation values that we're not really applying them yet. We will definitely start to apply them as we make recommendations, as we look more closely at our budget, and as we have to do those trade-off activities, but want to keep showing them to you all. It's actually incomplete, so I apologize. I'll make sure the completed slide with stability is available at our next meeting. Next slide. Also want to remind all of our participants. Next slide, Ms. Vivian, please.
I'm doing it.
Okay, Ms. Pauline. I want to remind you all that in our appendix of every single slide deck, there are all the key terms. We definitely still take questions if you need clarification around terms as we share them. We want to remind you that this resource is there. Next slide. And we also want to remind you that as you continue to have questions, we are trying our best to keep up with the cadence of your questions and move your questions to the link that's linked here on the left and respond to your questions as much as possible. So I'm gonna be really honest, we're a little bit behind. So if you had a question and you look on there and you're like, they still haven't answered, please forgive us. We will definitely be updating it over the next week or so. And we'll continue to add the new questions as they come about. Next slide. All right. So before we get into our first agenda activity, which is looking at some of the recommendations that have come through from our other advisory committees or organizations that you represent, we want to stop to allow Ms. Vivian to do our SBAC roll call and to see if there's any public comments. Ms. Vivian?
Thank you. I didn't receive any requests for public access,
So I'll just roll into the roll call. PTA President? Terry Pastika?
Here.
Sarah Parker?
Here.
Vicky Davis?
Here.
Vicky, yeah.
Nicole Chabot?
Here.
Lindsay Nofelt?
Here.
Catherine Marta? Hilda Valencia? Ozzy? Noor Aguilar? Dan Lindheim?
Here.
Jenny Morgan? Emily Nathan? Natasha Beery? Jocelyn Foreman? Mildred is sick. Yazid Khalil?
Here.
Frank Hernandez? Shauna?
I'm here.
Frank's here.
Matt Meyer?
Here.
Austin is here.
Regina Shigola?
Here.
Lisa Billings? Or Lisa said she's running late.
Yeah.
Yeah, Janine Waddell? Steve Collins?
Here.
Mark McNally? Ann Dixon?
Here.
Tonya Coleman?
Here.
Kathy Fleming?
Here.
Jill? Colleen Folensby?
Here.
Did you say Jill Hogendijk? I didn't.
Yes, Jill? Okay, see you. Trish McDermott? Liza Estepin? And Nikia Ford Martel. Okay, that's it.
Thank you. So next slide, please. So at our last SBAC meeting, you were given an assignment. We talked about how you come in and you show up as you, but you are also here as representative of a committee, an organization, or a group, right? So we have folks from BCCE, we have folks from the Parent Advisory Council, we have folks from DLAC, et cetera. And so it's really important in the spirit of true collaboration and representation that when you come, you're bringing the ideas, the feedback, and the perspectives of those from the group that you represent. And so one of the activity that we gave you all at the last meeting was for you to go back and share with your committee, first of all, the prior year recommendations, because again, we are going to have to make some decisions and have some conversations around what are we going to continue to do, what we might stop to do, what we need to do that's new. And so we asked you to take those recommendations to your committee just to get their feedback. What did they notice? What's missing? What questions, et cetera. We also asked you to take the opportunity to engage your committee in a conversation to see, we share with you all some of our thinking of some current and new needs, but to see if there were any current or new needs or some asks or requests from your committee. And so you were all asked to complete this committee sheet. It's linked here. It requires that you make a copy as soon as you open it. And you were also asked to share it with Vivian. So we only got one. I know a lot of you completed it because I talked to some of you guys. You were like, we did it, but we didn't get them all in, or we didn't get them all in prior to this this evening's meeting. And so we have one, and we're going to use that one as an example. But our goal and our thinking is that as they come in and we see questions, we're going to use some of our SBAC time to answer those questions. But we also are going to ultimately have some breakout groups and conversations around the recommendations and the asks from the different groups. But tonight we're going to, again, use the one that we had as an opportunity for us to start a conversation. So next slide, please. So the one that was submitted to us was from BFT. And you see that we just reproduced the feedback or the content from BFT's form. We looked at what did BFT see and notice, but they looked at the past spending and they noticed there was not really any new priorities. And Regina and Matt, please stop me if I'm representing your content wrong. They also said that they needed some details on which new expenditures are one-time and which are ongoing. And we know that's a conversation we have to have. because I think when we did our observations that first round in SBAC groups, we noticed, at least my group noticed, that there were some things that were listed as ongoing expenses, but they were assigned to one-time funds or quote unquote soft money. So BFT actually echoed that same sentiment, and they said that we need to understand the difference between the ongoing and the one-time before we're able to actually make any responsible decisions. They also wanted to understand the rationale for some of the proposed costs, and I appreciate that bullet or that ask, because again, as we think about trade-offs, we're going to have those conversations. Is this cost worth it? A little bit of that goes back to that core value. That's really about us engaging in continuous improvement and seeing if the resource, the program, or the allocation itself is actually doing what it's intended to do. And then our BFT colleagues asked, when and how will costs associated with negotiations be represented? What Pauline is going to help us with right now is that in the question section of their template, BFT members asked 2 questions. Why is there an LCAP consultant? So when they were looking at the recommendations and the things that we funded, they saw an LCAP consultant. And they were hired specifically when the director job was vacant and never went away. So BFT, we're going to take some time to try to respond to that question. And it was the BFT question, but it might be a question that other groups have, which is why we're doing this process or this protocol. BFT also wanted to know what records are being digitized and why. You might recall that in our new needs slide that we showed last meeting, we talked about the needs to digitize our records, and that's not a cheap ask. And so BFT had that question. So we're going to use BFTs as a model and as an example, and we do hope to get more of these in so that we can make sure that you and your committee's questions are answered and that you have the information that you need in order to make the recommendations that we're going to make together as a group. So that first question, we have Pauline here, and we have Jill Hogendijk, our Associate Superintendent of Instruction. Don't worry, Lindsay, it's okay. If groups didn't get yours in, like I said, I know everybody has a different calendar, a different cadence. So I know we got some overachievers in the room. So don't worry if you didn't get your assignment in, it's all good. And we have a lot of content today anyway, so we're going to be able to get to one example. So if you didn't do yours, just share it with Vivian. There's a couple of you guys who shared it with Vivian, sorry, but they're blank. If you want to, I think a good practice is just to share it with Vivian even before your committee has met. That way, once it's filled in, you don't have to remember to share it with her. We could just go in our folder and see what you said. So with that, we're going to address the 2 questions from BFT. And that first one is, why is there an LCAP consultant? So you want to start with that one, Jill?
Sure, and I'm happy to help weigh in, and I think Lisa's here, so if I'm missing anything, she can weigh in. But so there's been some history there. I think it is true that the LCAP consultant was hired before there was a director. And then my understanding is that Dr. Stevens, in scoping out that position for the director of categorical programs and special projects, point 1 of Lisa's current position covers the LCAP, which we know is the LCAP is a pretty big component of our district's work. And so we've maintained that capacity of the consultant who has really helped us with the survey, some of the survey work, completing some of the artifacts that we have and are able to use for our parent advisory committee meeting, and helps with the submission and some of the components of the submission of that LCAP. So that's part of what that has been covered.
Okay, Matt has his hand up.
I was just going to ask if our BFT reps have any additional questions. I will say, for the benefit of the group, looking at the recommendations link that we have, the LCAP consultant /support was identified as a one-time one-time resource, and it was $50,000 was allocated. So just to give you that context. Matt?
I guess I just wanted to share just a concern on this topic, and then I'll be done. And that is, before we had the consultant, the EAC, the Educator Advisory Committee that was part of the process, met at the same cadence as all the other groups. And then we actually opened up more capacity by having the consultant. And yet at the same time, the Educators Advisory Committee, which are people on the ground doing the work, right? And that's always the question, you know, like what's actually happening. And it's principals, it's IAs, it's teachers, it's site TSAs and district TSAs, to be able to like comment and give information. So I think that's my concern, right? Is that we're spending money on a consultant, which is a choice and we may continue to do, but yet at the same time, it actually feels like there's been less of a process. So we're spending money, and I just have some institutional memory here because I used to go to all these meetings, and it was Pasquale who it was, you know, was before Jill, before Bache, right? And it was someone before Michelle Sinclair, and oh, it's Pat Sadler. And they were the ones that did the LCAP process together. And, you know, and I just wanted to say that we may, you know, the district may decide to continue to spend money on this consultant, but if we're doing so, I would hope we'd end up with a better process in the end.
Thank you for that feedback. And I think that's helpful for the larger group, again, because when we're talking about evaluating where we're allocating our dollars and how we're advocating our dollars, you just heard, at least from one perspective, one group's perspective, that, right, it maybe we want to consider or rethink that allocation, or at very least ask the question of how is that allocation being, how is it supporting us in our efforts? And if the idea of this consultant was that it would improve the process, or right, then we should be looking for indicators that say the process has gotten better. The other question that BFT raised was what records are being digitized and why? I'm gonna let you start with that one, Pauline.
Okay, so we had looked at digitizing records for the entire district, and the genesis of this were the student records that were at the high school. We wanted to actually digitize them so that we would not need to find additional storage for these records. And when we're looking at those particular records, Max is our IT director. He was trying to get an idea of what records are being scanned or digitized in the district. And what he found out was that every department is kind of doing their own thing. So in fiscal, we have someone that's scanning the payroll records. In HR, I believe they have another vendor that's scanning records, and these records are being scanned and being filed, not necessarily in the same format. So what Max was trying to do was to consolidate the district's digitizing process so that it's standardized, it's readily indexed, anyone can find any records. And we are running into an issue right now where in terms of trying to find physical records, sometimes it's more challenging than we would like. So we think digitizing is a good next step, but a consolidated effort to digitize not only the financial records, but the student records as well. So I meet with Max regularly in our one-on-one once every 2 weeks. So we're revisiting this. We have a cost proposal that might not be as significant as we originally thought, but Max is also still gathering information about all the different methods that are being used and trying to consolidate it just as a district-wide effort. So with the records that are at the high school that are now being stored for over $100,000 a year, we are thinking that if we digitize those first, like have a planned approach, and I will be bringing that back to the group as I get more information from Max. Any questions? Oh, sorry.
I was just going to add to what you were saying, Pauline, that currently we're housing like physical records back to the early 1900s. I wasn't even born yet, right? Nobody got that. That's a really long time. And so that means that there's implications for physical space, right? And so we were using actually using rooms in BHS, and we know we need rooms in BHS to house these documents. And then like Pauline just said, now we're storing them, but we're paying a cost at the tune of $100,000 to store these. The other thing is that you all might have heard of something called PRAs, or public requests. I said the A wrong. Basically, it's people from the public requesting information. And oftentimes, those requests require us to go back into files, right? About employees, about students, et cetera. And the law gives us a set time frame with which to respond to these requests. And we're finding that we're also very inefficient in being able to respond because we're spending so much time trying to access and find information. So wanted to add that to what Pauline said as well. For the good of the group, I will remind you all that when we shared new needs and expenses back at our meeting on February 21st, that's where we first showed the digitizing district records as a possible need or new expense. And the dollar amount assigned to it was $2 million, and it was parentheses that it could be phased in. So I just want to make sure you guys are aware of what these numbers are looking like as you're thinking about and hearing the responses to these inquiries. Any other questions from BFT or any other questions from other folks around those two, the LCAP consultant or even the digitizing of the records? All righty then. PRA. Yes, thank you, Dan. Public Records Act. I know they're always, oh, hi, sweetie. They're always asking for information. So so wanted to make sure I know that. And we're keeping notes. And of course, this is recorded, so you don't have to memorize any of this. But I appreciate BFT's questions and appreciate staff for answering them. And we are going to have that conversation specifically around the digitizing of our records, because that is something that we've named as a new need. And again, it's going to require that we make some decisions and possibly have some trade-offs. So with that, I want to remind every committee representative to please remember to share your doc, your committee's doc with Vivian, whether you've completed it or not. And then as we go on with SBAC, we will continue to bring these to answer questions and to try to provide as much clarification as possible. Again, we just happen to have one this time. Our goal is to do multiple in any one particular meeting. So with that, we're going to close out that agenda item, and we're going to move now to learning and hearing about some of our other revenue sources. And the first one that we're going to learn about is going to be our Arts and Music Block Grant. And I'm going to turn it over to Pauline. I'm going to be monitoring the chat in case there's questions, but we'll do Arts and Music Block Grant first, and then answer and ask questions, and then we'll go on to our BCEP after that. So Pauline.
Okay, thank you. So you might remember that in the governor's budget, he had proposed the 2 block grants. This is just one of them, the Arts, Music, and Instructional Materials Block Grant. But even before that, at our last SBAC, when we closed out, we were talking about $13 million in unrestricted general fund that we're going to get from the state. And we know that with the governor's enacted budget for 22-23, that this funding actually came in the format of 2 block grants. So this was one of the block grants, and this is my focus of this presentation. And it talks about needing a board approved plan. So the plan must be discussed and approved during a regularly scheduled board meeting. So where we are in the process, we're actually finalizing a plan. And I think this is going to the board. Do we have a date as yet, Jill? I can't remember. But we're working in our budget leadership team. We're looking at the requirements for this grant and coming up with a plan, because I think what we have determined is what we had for the $13 million unrestricted is not going to be an easy transition into this board approved, into the board approved plan, or the what we can use this plan for. On this slide, funds must be spent by June 30th, 2026. So we have a considerable amount of time to spend this grant. So on this slide, we want to focus just on the purpose. I have a link here to the guidance and allowable uses, but it's basically to obtain a standards aligned professional development and instructional materials in specified areas obtains professional development on improving school culture, develop diverse and culturally relevant book collections, operational costs, and COVID personal protective equipment. So I've just kind of broken some of these out a little bit further, and there's a lot more detail in the link. So when we look at standards aligned professional development, in the link, there are specified subject areas. There are about 10 subject areas that they're recommending that this grant be spent on. And also the instructional materials and professional development. It talks about improving school climate. There's also in terms of the requirement to develop diverse book collections and obtain culturally relevant texts, and our operational costs. It's including but not limited to retirement and health costs increases. And also there's a COVID-19 component in terms of PPE, masks, cleaning supplies, and ventilation upgrades, and other similar expenses to keep students and staff safe. So what we're doing in BLT, we're trying to see how other districts will be spending this the funding that we have for this. It's called AMIM grant, and of course I have program. Oh, never mind. So anyway, the issues that we're having, most districts, a lot of districts are focusing on the operational costs, but we think to honor the needs of this funding, we're also trying to look at a balance in terms of how much should be spent on professional development, how much on instructional materials, COVID costs, there may be a need there, and also operational costs. A word of funding, the initial funding from the governor's enacted budget last year, we thought we were going to get $5.9 million. We know there's a mid-year cut based on the governor's January budget of $2 million. So we're looking at a $3.9 million that we have to spend by June 2026. And our funding amount, we're actually waiting for confirmation from CDE. We haven't gotten our allocation amount, but this is our estimate of what we're going to be funded. So so that's it in a nutshell. We'll be looking at this funding source in more detail, and possibly in terms of swaps, what could we swap in to this grant, and also respect the use, or at least acknowledge the intent of the grant, and also look at how it will impact the general fund. So, and I have some typos in my link, but are there any questions on that before? So it's still pretty much in the developmental stage, but we know the funding that we're working with, and we know the uses, and we have the timeline. Yes, Matt.
Sorry, just a clarifying question. Based on this slide, it's hard for me to understand what is the contribution that you think may come from the general fund, and to clarify that be a one-time contribution, not a ongoing contribution.
Oof. No, there's no contribution from the general fund.
Oh,
I'm
okay,
just mentioning this as an alternative funding source. We have $3.9 million that originally we thought was unrestricted. We had identified some costs. So we'll be developing that further at another meeting, not at this meeting. But this has nothing, we haven't talked about actual swaps or anything as yet, because it's still pretty much in the developmental stage.
Okay, thank you.
The other reason why I think this is important, again, even though this group is really focused on the unrestricted general funds, what we know is that there were some recommendations made, right? When Berkeley thought these funds were unrestricted and kind of discretionary, they were like, let's do this, let's do that, right? And then we were like, surprise, they're restricted or categorical, which means there's some things we couldn't do with this money. Necessarily, that means that we need to rethink if we're going to continue to do those things, how and where are we going to fund those things? And it might be from general fund. So that's another kind of us front loading and starting to think about how we're going to have these conversations around trade-offs and priorities. The other thing that I was going to say is pointing out that the mid-year cut in the budget, we should probably put an asterisk next to that because it is not guaranteed yet. It is, what do we say, Jill? Probable, is possible, but it's not guaranteed. And so what we've been told is to kind of hold that money just in case. But I do want you all to know that it's not a definite. But the other thing that if it does happen, right, again, that's going to have some implications around how we're funding the things that we planned to fund with this source when it was going to come in its entirety. I see there's a comment in the chat about BSEP. I'm going to hold that one, Terry, for when we get to the BSEP section, if you don't mind, unless you can help me understand if it's relevant for this one. I think it is specific to BSEP, so I'm going to hold, and I'm going to take, Terry still has their hand up, so I'm going to take Terry and then Nicole with regard to this one. All right, Terry?
Oh, my question was just, our community that you're looking at also has something like BSEP, which funds many of the things that you already referenced in that list. Take an apples to apples comparison with the districts you're looking at. That was my baseline question.
Terry, I kept
Did you
getting
hear
some
that?
feedback. I couldn't hear because I was getting feedback. I'm not sure if Pauline, you heard it.
No, I didn't hear it. Can you say that again, Terry?
Terry, I think Terry has a bad reception, so I can ask her question for her. That's why my hand is raised. It's her question I'm going to ask. Is basically, Pauline, you mentioned that you are going to look at some other nearby districts to figure out how they're spending this money.
Yeah.
And so the question is really, of those other districts, do they also have a BSEP type of measure that provides supplemental funding? Because most of the things that it sounds like can be paid for with this grant are partial line items in BSEP already.
Not, I don't think there are any other districts that are funded to the level that BSEP actually funds the district. But I think just to be, just for the spirit of the grant, PD, instructional materials, I think we need to make sure that we have like a balance and not just use the entire $3.9 million for PERS and STIRS or increased medical costs. So that's the only caveat that I have, just in terms of spending the funds, because we want to really make sure that, and if we're spending these funds, then the trade-off might be with BSEP. You know, can we use these funds and use BSEP funds for other things in accordance with the measure? So, so the trade-off, the general fund or with BSEP or any other funding source. I just want to be sensitive to the needs of the grant. Vicky has her hand up.
Yeah, I was just reading the link, the allowable uses, and this fund allows like science and ethnic studies and other things like that, that BSEP is really just VAPA things. So there are a few things in here specifically that we could do in addition to what BSEP does.
So what Vicky is talking about is this section further on, and I'll just share my screen here. Instruction, you're talking about the instructional materials, Vicky? So world languages, mathematics, science, is that what you're talking about?
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
so-
like computer science, media literacy, ethnic studies, science, math. So things like math coaches or things like that could be used for this money versus BSEP doesn't cover any of those types of things.
Okay, thanks, Vicky. Any comments? Any additional comments?
I see in the chat that Matt said that these are one-time dollars, and so it's tricky. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that at all, Matt. But
I was just trying not to take up too much space, so I chatted instead.
because
I'll just say that any swap that gets done is essentially a one-time swap, right? Because these aren't ongoing dollars. So even if you take something from BSEP, you end up with a problem 2 years later.
You're down, right?
right? It's not one time as in 1 year, but it will run
Right.
out, has a timeline.
Right.
Positions, same problem, can't do positions. But there are some one-time stuff that you all listed that we know materials, right, are great one-time spending. So there's stuff out there, but so I think that, and that's usually the problem, and it's not our problem, it's a state problem with these kinds of grants, right? That, it's just really hard to find things that are one time because our needs are typically not one time.
And I think
Correct.
I think I pulled that comment out, Matt, because I was gonna make a shameless plug for my core resource allocation, my resource allocation core values, and that's the one around sustainability. So when you're looking at one-time funds, right, it doesn't mean that you can't fund things on that, to the point that Matt was just making. It just means that you have to have a plan for how are you going to continue to fund that after those monies are gone or have expired, right? And oftentimes what happens is we not just BUSD, but we as educators and folks who are doing things with school budgets, we'll fund things that are important, that we want to be ongoing on one-time dollars. And then we're like, what now when those dollars expire? And they always expire. So it's not to discourage anyone. We're going to have a big, robust conversation when it's time about that. But it's for us to hold in our heads that if we assign things, for example, to this block grant to avoid putting it on the general fund, let's say, we need to be thinking beyond just next year and figure out what's our plan to continue those things and make sure that it's sustainable. So thank you. Any more questions around this grant? And again, this is really just about your understanding, because again, just how we just gave an example of, it does and it will impact how we make decisions and things we want to do with our general funds.
I think Shauna's hand is up.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I as the person who accepts donations from parents for classroom supplies for art and music at the high school, there's a really big need for this money. A really big need for this money. So if you have any questions to direct towards me, I can show you the budget needs that are ongoing, that are being filled in by parents giving donations for photography, for ceramics, for art, for digital art, for music trips, for a lot of areas, including, on a smaller scale, environmental science. There's just a lot of need for this kind of money for this. Yeah, be great.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks, Shauna. And one other thing I want to mention about the mid-year cut, the governor is doing exactly what we are not supposed to be doing, which is using one-time money for ongoing costs. So what I heard in the conference that I attended, he's actually planning to use the cuts from this funding source to fund the COLA in 23-24. But again, as Anika says, this is still to be confirmed, and we're still waiting for the actual proposed funding amount from CDE. So is that it? No more questions. We can start. I'll turn it over to Kathy.
Okay, thank you, Pauline. Hi, everybody. Hi, I'm Kathy Fleming. I'm the Director of Local Resources. I know many of you. And in my role, I manage 2 of our parcel taxes, BERA, which is the Berkeley Educator Recruitment and Retention Act, which is compensation for our educators and funds for recruitment and retention activities, and BSEP, our Berkeley Schools Excellence Program. So today we're going to review some basic information about BSEP to get everybody up to speed. And you can use this link to find out more information about BSEP. And just a note that we do have 4 of our P&O members elected to this committee, 2 serve as voting members and 2 serve as alternates. So we do have planning and oversight in the House. So thank you for being here, folks. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just an overview of BSEP. The Berkeley Schools Excellence Program is a voter-approved tax measure. In 2016, it was renewed for 8 years by the voters of Berkeley. This year is the 6th year of the measure, and BSEP is providing approximately 35 million for our schools. And it supports smaller class size libraries, arts, music programs, professional development, courses, and staffing for schools support for students, and school site program funds. Our current BSEP measure sunsets at the end of 2024-25. We will need to renew BSEP in order to continue the critical programming and support that BSEP provides to every student in every school. Next slide, please. BSEP has a long history of support from the Berkeley voters. It was first created and approved by the voters in 1986. It's funny to say 19, I'm so used to 20. In response to the passage of Proposition 13, which dramatically decreased funding for schools. While the measure has included various programs and staffing supports for schools, the one consistent purpose has been class size reduction, which is represented in each pie chart here by the blue section for each of the BSEP measures. Smaller class size contributes to stabilizing our workforce and differentiates us from other Bay Area school districts. With smaller classes, teachers are able to better respond to individual student needs, and it allows for more direct attention. Next slide, please. Here's a snapshot of the percentages of the programs in BSEP, and these percentages are codified in the measure language. So the larger part of the pie, the green part, is the high quality instruction area, and that's the green section. That's 66% of the funding, and the majority of that goes to contribute to classroom teachers to reduce the class size. About 3/4 of this portion goes to that purpose. The remaining funds are allocated to professional development, program evaluation, classroom support, and expanded course offerings. The PD, the Professional Development Department, works to build and sustain our teacher capacity, and the Program Evaluation Funds is in support of our Brea office, that's the Berkeley Research Evaluation and Assessment Office, to assess the effectiveness of programs in the district to meeting their goals. Expanded course offerings provides middle school and high school students with a variety of course offerings before and after school, primarily enrichment and academic support classes that are not necessarily available during the instructional day. And the classroom support program area provides approximately 15 FTEs for programs in need beyond what's supported by the regular classroom teachers. And the next section is, the pink section is the school site programs. That's 10.25% of the allocation. That comes out this year to about $3.4 million for our school sites to use for discretionary purposes. It's a per pupil allocation. And libraries is 7.25% of the allocation, and VAPA, music and VAPA is 6.25%, and our instructional technology department receives 3.25%, and our student achievement strategies and counseling and behavioral health is 7%, and 2% of the net receipts is for the oversight and communication translation office. Okay, next slide, please. And we're fortunate to have a number of oversight mechanisms in place for accountability and transparency. This is a snapshot of what we have in place to ensure that the funds are spent in accordance with the measure. The Planning and Oversight Committee is an elected body, elected by the school site councils. They meet regularly throughout the school year, and these meetings are open to the public. Meeting agendas include the presentations of detailed plans and reports for all of the BSEP resources and programs, and all of the plans, budgets, and reports are posted online and ultimately approved by the P&O and then approved by the board after that. Oversight and accountability protections include fiscal controls such as tracking revenue and expenditures in a specific fund of its own and annual audits. And that concludes my brief presentation on BSEP.
So we are now going to open it up to any questions about BSEP. I think this is it's a good one, not just because Kathy's amazing at talking about it and sharing it, but because we are one of the few places where our community really, says we support public education, we support our babies, we support the initiatives of the district. by setting aside such a large amount of money. I and Jill both come from San Francisco. We've also been in Hayward, and there are similar models. When in San Francisco, there was something called PEEF, but nothing have I ever seen to this extent and this level of funding in ways that really does, support and hold such a significant amount of the district's budget. And when I came here and I saw the percentage that VSEP holds and carries and the things that Berkeley Unified is able to do because of the VSEP funding, I personally was overwhelmed and inspired by it all. And I think it then means that there are things that we can do with our general funds differently because we have this this funding source. So again, opening up to you all to ask questions, because your understanding of what VSEP funds, what VSEP is and isn't, I think is important, again, as we start to move into conversations around what we need as a district and how we fund those needs using our general fund. So with that, I'm going to see if there's any questions. I don't see anything in the chat. Maybe I do. Does BCC have direct professional development? That's not a VSEP one, so I'll come back to that one. Unless, Jocelyn, is that VSEP? No, backwards.
What?
You want us to come back to that one, Jocelyn?
No, that was a question for the other funding source.
Got it.
Just that question.
Got it. Okay, so let's do some VSEP questions, and then when we're done, we'll go back to that one around the arts and music block grant. Is that okay, Jocelyn?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. Okay, I'm scanning all the little boxes. I don't see any VSEP questions. What's this?
VSEP is crystal clear.
Okay, I'm a teacher. I can do the wait time.
Some of us have a lot of experience with BSEP, so we don't have questions about it.
Hey, look, I'm here for it. All right, and what we might do is when we get to, again, when we're talking about recommendations and the different asks that committees or that this committee is grappling with, we might just go back and review BSEP, and we can say, oh no, BSEP holds that, or BSEP carries that, or BSEP doesn't, right? So if there are no more questions, we might actually end on time.
We're gonna end early, I think, because don't we go until 5:30? Oh, wait.
Yeah. Pauline just trying to end early. Okay.
I have a lot of things to say.
Pauline, if you don't mind going back a couple slides, going back to our arts and music grant, because
I think I can try to answer that question. Hi, Jocelyn. I also just want to acknowledge that BCC members were involved in a survey that Paula Phillips was help directing. So we got a lot of really great information back, particularly from our IAs about their professional development needs. I think what's a little bit tricky about arts, music, and instructional materials is the way that the template that we have to fill out for the plan is that they're looking at professional development specifically around content areas. So I don't want to lose your comment here about other PD needs, particularly for our classified folks. And I thought I understood that gets coordinated by Paula Phillips so that we do try to understand what those PD needs are as we're planning out those very limited PD days that we have with our classified colleagues. So I'll definitely pass this message along to Paula.
Okay, so with that, I think the next thing is our trade-off activity. So this is not an intense slide, still being developed somewhat, but we want to preface it with you can do anything, but not everything. So those of you who've been in SBAC before, you know that we look at the unrestricted general fund, we look at BSEP, we look at other funding sources. And in this example, I'm looking at the funding buckets and the trade-offs. We're looking at, for instance, pension costs. So this is a very simple demonstration. And again, as Matt pointed out, this is a 3-year grant. It ends in 26. So this would be a one-time relief. And even if we're spending a third of the funding on, say, pension costs, we would relieve the general fund on a one-time basis of $1 million, which means that it's freeing up $1 million of expenses to be used on a one-time basis. So that would be for 23-24. If we said the AIM block grant would pick up $500,000 of this, and other funding sources to be identified would pick up 500. This is what a trade-off activity would look like. And we've done this before several times in BSEP, but we're just breaking it down for our newer members, and also to realize that we do have this other block grant that could be used on a one-time basis through 2026. And this would be an allowable use if we're spending a third on pension costs. And another example, if we looked at healthcare costs and transferred $600,000 into that, we now have relieved the general fund of $1.6 million to free up the ability for one-time costs to go into the unrestricted general fund. So we are pretty early in the process. Last year, we were a lot further along because we started the budget development cycle in October. So we're taking taking it a little bit slower than we would have been in terms of actually coming up with the second interim or presenting the second interim to SBAC. That's going to the board tomorrow night. So we want to preview the second interim at the board tomorrow night, but the multi-year projection for 23-24 will be the jump off point. But after we present that to the board, we will then be bringing back actual examples and start the actual work of looking at additional expenses and trade-offs. So this is just for illustrative purposes at this time. And when we get the second interim, we'll have more information to share with the group. So that was it. I really didn't have anything else to share, Anika, at this time. Terry has her hand up.
This is for Kathy. Kathy, at what point do you think you're going to be bringing an estimated number to SBAC related to BSEP budgets and the monies, what you think have to be transferred into the general fund for responsibly ending the measure over the next couple of years?
Well, we are going to look at an update to the class size reduction and support for teaching section of BSEP at the next meeting on Tuesday. And within that presentation, I'll include an update to the multi-year projection scenario, and we'll be showing you a proposed strategy for that. So stay tuned.
But when does that information come to SBAC for consideration, separate from the P&O? I'm trying to understand that timeline. Please.
I'll have to work on aligning that timeline with Anikia and Pauline, but it's a stay tuned. And by the time we have our meeting next Tuesday, I'll have that information for you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So Terry, from that meeting that Kathy's going to have, we can then start to populate our needs before our at the March 21st meeting.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Any other questions or? So oh, Terry, your hand is still up. So one of the things that I've been asked to provide additional information on is our consultants. So I'll be putting that in our shared folder. Staff have actually worked on that in terms of consultants in the general fund and the tasks that they're actually performing. And Matt, I think that was a question that you had, or you wanted to know if consultants were actually performing staff duties. And in the fiscal arena, we do have someone providing fiscal director support. while we try to hire a new fiscal director. And for those of you who knew Liz Karam, she has retired from the district in January. So we will be celebrating Liz. We'll be having an occasion to celebrate Liz. So we'll be reaching out to some of you who knew Liz and worked with Liz. Will be celebrating her years of service with the district. Also, I just lost my train of thought, but just in terms of moving forward, we also have a consultant working on assisting payroll. T-Song, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Thanks. I noticed that you distinguished between different funding sources, and a question that I don't know why it never occurred to me earlier, but do you look at PTA contributions also as a funding source? A large portion of the funds that are raised by PTAs across the district tend to support FTEs. So that seems like it's an important part of the larger picture.
We depend on each site to work with their individual PTAs and identify funding needs in their site plans. So it would not necessarily be at this meeting that it will be considered, because each site works with their own PTAs. And actually, it's not, well, I don't know if anybody wants to comment on using PTA funds for FTE. But when that happens, because it's not a sustainable source of funding, it makes it problematic. And when we go back to our core values, funding staff on soft money can be problematic. So does that answer your question, Tisa?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Vicky?
Yeah, I think I just want to jump on after that is the idea that there are many PTAs who funded salaries for the past 10 years and have been sustaining it. So maybe a better question is at some point, maybe the district should look at what FTEs, PTAs are funding and see if they can stop the PTA from funding those and move that to the general fund or the arts fund or BSEP funding. Versus the PTAs continuing to fund all of those positions.
I would just say that that's definitely some of the conversations that we're having, and for many reasons. But one of the reasons is that even though, to your point, there are examples of PTAs who are able to fund positions and or programs, right, for multiple years, inherently, one of the results of that possibly, I would say not even possibly, one of the results of that is inequity, right? That means that some schools and some schools have staffing and programs that others don't. And that in itself is not a bad thing, but we are, just to the question that you just asked or the point that you just made, really thinking about what do we want to make sure that all of our students and all of our schools have access to with regard to programs and with regard to staffing. And those are the things we fund, and what are the things that are kind of above and beyond. I personally do not agree, and I think my team would say it too. It is not the best practice that things that are necessary, like foundational, basic things, should be funded by PTA, right? We want to figure out how we can use general funds and other funding sources to make sure all of our schools have those things in place, and that the things that our PTAs are supporting are above and beyond what every school gets. So there is some inherent inequities that we're exploring, and we agree with you that there should be things that we move to say that we're going to provide the funding for this, so that PTA is not tasked with doing so.
Just a follow-up question to that, and maybe this isn't the right group to discuss it, but I guess our question is as well is who decides, oh, every school gets a 0.5 literacy coach, or the district has one math coach, like when those decisions are made on how the district supplies funding, and then the school sites think, oh, well, we really need more than that, so we're going to fund it ourselves. So I think that discussion of deciding what the standard is of what should be funding is a larger discussion so that we can have equity across the district.
Yep, totally agree. One of the things that we talk about this year is our focus on organizational clarity. And a part of that really is looking at just instructional coherence, and that forces us to have a conversation of what does every school need to have to accomplish the goals or the things that we say we want to happen in our schools. So that conversation is still in process, or in progress, I guess you should say. But you're right, we are having those conversations. And I think that's something that we can definitely share with SBAC if those conversations are completed in time, so that you all can know and hear what we're saying we think is needed at every site in order to realize and kind of keep the promises that we've said we want to be true for instruction and otherwise.
Jill had her hand up. Jill?
Yeah,
And then Matt.
I would just want to add on to that, that might be a process over time. So I'll give a specific example of one of the areas that we're looking at right now. So different from the AMIM, the Arts, Music and Instructional Materials Block Grant, we are also anticipating that we will be getting Prop 28 funds. And the intention behind those Prop 28 funds is to go to it's a direct allocation for school sites to be able to fund FTE for arts and music programming. We already know, to Nicole's earlier point, that we have robust support from our Berkeley community to support the music program. But our HR team has taken a look at the PTA funded positions that are specific to art. So once we do have confirmation on those Prop 28 funds, those allocations will go to school sites, and the schools will be, the school breakdown is an 80-20. They have to spend 80% of that on FTE. And what we know is that not all of our schools are currently spending PTA money on FTE for the arts. And so that will be able to swap. One of the tricky things about the Prop 28 funds is that we do not actually have formal guidance yet from the state. We only have information that's currently in the legislation. So I know that folks are anxious to get that allocation, but what we have shared with principals is that we're going to get the best information out that we have right now, but we can't make plans on funds that we don't have yet. So they might need Plan A, which is I currently pay for a dance teacher with PTA funds. And when we get the Prop 28 funds, we can swap that out. And so Plan B would be, once we have additional capacity in PTA funds, how might we use that money? So I know that that's not, everybody would really want the guidance right now, but that's one example of how we are looking at PTA funded positions and where it might be appropriate to swap that out, which is going to be one part of that bigger conversation about how we're using PTA funds.
Thanks, Jill. Matt is up, and then Terry.
Mine's just a really quick comment on this topic, and that is with the PTA funds, it does allow for some more flexibility since it is soft money and it's technically like temporary funding with how that money is spent, especially if it's on people, if it's the district, especially when it comes to classified positions because of the merit commission. You may not get the person who's been there for a long time. It's just different. That site might not even get to choose who they hire, right? And I just want to say it's just a process point, right? That it's a double-edged sword, right? If those things do get moved to the district, it will just create a different series of processes around if we're talking about people who might be in that position and how they get there. And you could lose some flexibility. It's just something to be aware of.
Thanks, Matt. Terry, you're up next.
Thank you. So to Matt's point of kind of being aware of what the kind of overall situation looks like, is it possible for us to get an understanding of PTA funds related to how, in a comprehensive manner, how much PTA overall is funding FT FTE positions. Because I think related to the budget, if we're being asked to take a look at that and think about things, and the district is thinking about priorities, it would be helpful for us to know what is in totality the composite look like. I don't know if the PTA Council has done that research or where that information is, but I assume that information is collated someplace. And if so, is that something we can see just in terms of straight numbers?
We have
Terry.
that. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Go
I was
ahead.
just to mention, Terry, we've been working on a project for quite some time to collate exactly that information. So we're hoping to put a nice bow around it. I've been trying to get our team to pull it all together so that we can share it with everyone. But we do have information on how funds are raised at each site, and the broad BSEP categories to which they're currently applied. So hopefully we'll have some.
But the district should have that information too, right? I mean, or maybe it's not collected. Maybe it's easier for the PTA to do it versus the district.
Actually, not necessarily. The SIPSAs all seem to have, if you look at the budgets at the end of every SIPSA that's found at every site, you'll have a breakdown of certain types of line items and how they are funded, whether it's type 1, Title I or LCAP or PTA. That might give you a sense, and I think Danielle has a roll-up of that, so that might be a good starting point as well.
Okay, so I don't want to put PTA Council on the spot, but is that something that you think would be available to be passed on to the district or SBAC or whatever your formal process is that you're envisioning? Like, do you envision that being available sooner rather than later, or is this like a year long, like something not for like a year that you all think will be available?
The what I call the Danielle piece, I think that's available right now. And then PTA from its perspective is collating all that right now. And I hope to have it soon. Yeah.
Can I jump in? We do have a summary that, yes, Danielle does produce as part of the SIPSA process and the budgeting process. However, it will be a snapshot in time. It will be what was planned at that time when the budget was approved. So it might not necessarily be accurate, but that is a public document and it is posted online. So I can find that if this group wants to have that.
I can wait for PTA, but anyway, thank you.
Shauna, your hand is up.
Yeah, I just wanted to also mention that there's the development group, which we're not really mentioning. Yeah, maybe getting reporting from them on what they're funding. I don't know that they fund FTE. I'm not really certain, but also there's boosters associated with the high school that would be at play as well, with the athletics department having its own booster and funding and having a huge funding source there. I don't know how much. I've never seen any reports on that, as well as the jazz band group, them having their own nonprofit and doing their own fundraising. And so that all, like, if that could filter into, that would be interesting to see that from an oversight perspective of how these budgets are all working together.
Thanks, Shauna. Any other questions or observations? Well, looks like we're good. Anika, did you have anything else you needed to add or?
No, I just want to remind you all to just do your best to reach out to your committees so that at our next meeting, we can answer more questions and see some of the recommendations and the requests that are coming from the groups that you're representing. But I do want to, we're not getting out that early, Pauline. It's 5:15. And I want to appreciate everyone for their time and appreciate you just for your thoughtful questions. And you can continue to put questions in the chat. And again, I apologize that we are a little bit behind in getting responses to those questions, but if you drop them in the chat, I'm committing on behalf of Pauline and Jill, not me, on behalf of all of us, honestly, to make sure we make some space to get you those answers by our next meeting. So thank you for your time and have a wonderful evening. Our next meeting is on March 21st.
Yes. Okay.
That's a.
All right, so let me stop sharing and just say goodbye to everybody. Wave, wave, wave. See you
you.
guys. Natasha is here. Hi,
Hello, sorry to have been late.
The legend,
The
Natasha.
legend is
The legend
here.
was
You
late.
need a special background, like a big
Can
halo.
legends
Or...
be late? Can legends be late? I mean, if you're late, are you still a legend? I don't know.
I gotta
You'll
go.
always be a
Way to
legend.
go.
Have a good night, y'all.
All
Bye.
right, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Night, everyone. Thank you.